My guest on this episode is a truly remarkable guy who I have known for about 2 years now. And I don't want to say too much about his background, his life, or what he does, because anything that I say will be vastly eclipsed by hearing him in his own words. So without further ado, Joseph Tolton. 2, 1, and we are live recording. Joseph Tolton, thank you so much for joining me this beautiful Wednesday afternoon.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Jake.
Absolutely. So you and I first met almost 2 years ago now in August of 2018, and we started chatting. We were friends of friends even. And what immediately kind of fascinated me about you was the work that you do. So for people who don't know you, how would you describe your job, your occupation, kind of what you do?
I am a faith-based global activist with a specialty in LGBTI rights at the global level and also in Pan-Africanism.
So how did you come to be doing that?
That is such a great question. I grew up in the Pentecostal church, and for those that don't know what that means, essentially they are very conservative churches with a very fundamentalist theology and a very charismatic or highly energized form of worship where we believe in healing and deliverance and other demonstrative acts of God's kind of tactical touch and involvement with us as human beings. But the theology and the conservative nature of the theology was always a problem for me growing up because I always knew that I was a gay being and a gay person and human being, but yet I deeply love God. And beyond just kind of loving God and being very much attached to church culture, I always knew that there was this call upon my life to preach. And so I grew up with this great tension around charisma and competency in the pulpit. Even at the age of 10 years old, I was a little bit of a prodigy back in the 70s with my afro being able to barely be seen over the pulpit because I was so short. But my family loved it, and obviously people in my community loved it, but I always knew that there was a conflict and a tension between these two streams running in my person, this clear call to ministry and my sexuality. And it took many years to reconcile my sexuality. I eventually did that through majoring in religion in college, which wasn't theology. It was a small liberal arts school. I went to Vassar. And so it challenged me to really challenge the assumptions, the theological assumptions that had been the underpinnings of my life. And in time, after graduating from college and spending some time back again in my very conservative church as an adult, I was able to come to a decision that I needed to make a break from one of the major pillars in my life. And it meant that I had to construct some other points in my life and possibilities that would undergird me because the role of the traditional church and all that it brought in terms of its comforts would be gone. But the demonizing of me would also be gone, which would set me free. And so as a preacher, I felt compelled to start a church. And I did that in 2006 called Rehoboth Temple. The word Rehoboth literally in the Old Testament means God has made room for us. As Isaac dug several wells and was chased around by his enemies who essentially destroyed the wells. And finally he dug a well and no one chased after him to pursue him. And he called that Rehoboth. And I built a church where God had made room for all people to have access to the grace of God. That work as a local pastor here in Harlem morphed into this work of global justice in ways that are extraordinary to me, in that in 2009, the anti-gay bill in Uganda was tabled by Parliament. And at that point, my church in Harlem, Rehoboth, was a part of a network of like-minded, mostly African-American, LGBTQ-led churches. And I was given the assignment in part because of my great interest in social justice and the media work that I did. I have an advertising background. I was given the task among our network of churches to keep my eye on the situation in Uganda and monitor it. And amazingly, that led to my meeting bishop. His name is Christopher Sinyonjo. He was a bishop in the Anglican Church of Uganda who had been educated here in New York at Union Theological Seminary, a very progressive seminary. In the 1970s, he wrote his dissertation on human sexuality, and particularly in the African context, which broke his heart, mind, and soul wide open as a straight man from Uganda. Many years later, he was retired when the bill was introduced, and he built a center for the marginalized, and then really became the only voice of reason from a spiritual perspective, protecting and giving refuge and spiritual nourishment to the LGBTI community. He visited America. He was on a tour. I met him. We engaged, and there was just this kind of instant connection. He appreciated my love of faith, but also my business skills as a business manager. As I said, I'd been in the advertising and marketing world growing up at Young and Rubicam for many years, and he thought that was a really interesting combination. Invited me to Uganda on just a trip to be an ambassador of goodwill, to get to know the people and the land, and basically to say to them that people outside of their context were aware of the situation, were watching, monitoring, and were sending them expressions of love and faith and hope. And I thought I would come home and write a report and perhaps, raise some money to send to them. And then I would continue to monitor the situation, watching Rachel Maddow like everybody else. And I went, and my entire life changed. And within about a year, I realized that actually, not only what I was called to the work in Harlem, but that it really was a springboard to my doing this work of being not a missionary, because that word has such negative connotations, but an ambassador of goodwill for people of faith and people who believe in justice and equity in our country, to the Uganda situation. And that, of course, has evolved to my work being more global throughout Africa and beyond.
And I have to say, I'm just as struck hearing this story for the second and third time as I was at the first two. So, and there are so many points that I could touch on there. So let me to go back a little bit to the beginning of your life. So you gave your first sermon, if I'm remembering right, when you were 10 years old.
Absolutely.
So you can't overstate how important the church was in your upbringing and your life at that point.
Oh, I absolutely cannot overstate how important the church was. It was, I won't say that it was everything, because for many African Americans in the church, it is everything. Your social life is there, your family life is there, much of your community is there, and you do not have options for socialization or connectivity outside of the church. So you're kind of bound to that community. But for me, the church was a huge part of my world. I lived in Harlem with my mom and my grandmother. My mom was a nurse, but she was very sick, so she could not work. She was on disability. My grandmother was an aging domestic worker who eventually retired. And so, we were struggling essentially economically, but my mom was deeply committed to my receiving not just a fair education, but the best education that money could buy in New York City. Again, we lived in Harlem. She convinced the district superintendent that I should be released from our district and that I should be allowed to go to another district. And so, of course, she picked the best school in the city, elementary school in the city, which was PS6. I don't know what magic she worked on these people, because who gets released from an inner city district and is allowed to go to the best public school in the city and probably one of the best in the country? And going to PS6 created for me another world that I had. So outside of the church, I now had the world of my schoolmates and my friends. And then, from there, went to Columbia Prep and on down the line. And so the reason that is important is because as much as the church meant everything, it would be elitist of me to say to the average person in the church, just come out and give them no springboard or place to land. I had a place to land. I had a wonderful community of friends. In part, that's how I know you, through one of my friends now of 40 years in September. We went to Columbia Prep together in the 8th grade. But that circle was so important because they were there to nourish me and to hold me up and bear me up when the ties to the church began to break and began to sever. But yes, the church grounded me. The church lifted me up. The church believed in me. The church invested in me. And I'm deeply grateful for that, despite the pain that I experienced in that my being was at odds with our culture and theology.
Now, what was that like? This church that had been so important to you, and like you said, had maybe not been 100% of your life, but had been a cornerstone. it had been you would have family ties to it through your mother and your grandmother. You were deeply involved at a personal level, giving sermons. If I remember correctly, you were involved in the gospel choir. Is that right?
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
you even wrote music for them as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you were about as involved as anybody could be, and you were an essential part of it. So what was that like when, if I'm remembering the timeline right, around the time that you started to realize that maybe it wasn't the place for you, you were in college and finishing college?
So I realized that it was possibly not the place for me while I was in college, but I went back home and I continued to minister. And at this point now I was an adult, so I wasn't, the prodigy preacher, but I was kind of in the big leagues with all the other preachers. And I loved my pastor. I don't know if idolized is an appropriate word, but I loved him. He was sober and highly anointed. He labored in the gospel and he gave his life to what it is that he believed. And he was a man of honor, despite the fact that he was homophobic and a misogynist. But he was all of those things. And I was able to hold all of that. So when I returned to the church, as I said, I was in ministry, and obviously there were other young men my age that were in ministry. One of my best friends, if not my best friend in the church, and I walked together and ministered together. I have always been a gay man who has had tons of straight friends. Maybe it's my love of football. I don't really know, but relationships that were not complicated with my being confused about my desire for them, because these were platonic relations that were grounded and anchored in authentic brotherhood. And that was the relationship that I had with one of my dear brothers, who was my best friend in the church context. He was dating a young woman. They got engaged. And at this point, I was deep into therapy. My college friends and high school friends were kind of like standing on the sidelines whispering, come out, come out, come out, because they knew who I was. And I think that I reached a point where I was really ready to come out in the church, but didn't quite know how to do it. And as I look back on it, I think I probably set the course of these events in motion that I'm about to describe to you subconsciously, because I knew that they would lead to my having to go. My best friend in the church asked me to be his best man in his wedding. And I made a decision that I did not want to stand next to him at the altar, a liar, but that I was going to not just come out to him, but he and his fiance. I was going to tell them the truth about who I was, about my love for them, about the depth of my struggle, about the fact that I was now beginning to study the Bible and other sacred texts and other analogies and exegesis or deconstructions of the text to really get more of a contextual understanding of many of the texts of terror that have been used to demonize queer people. And that I wanted them to stand with me during this process. And I thought that was the honorable thing to do, so that I was not pretending to be something that I was not. They went to the assistant pastor in the church and they told him that someone had come out to them, and they wouldn't reveal my name, but that it was really troublesome and difficult for them. Now, we were Batman and Robin, literally, right? And I use that analogy.
Best friend. This was your best friend at the time.
Best friend. He was 4 inches taller, so I call us Batman and Robin. We were always together. And that broke me, because that set in motion a lot of gossip. And he and his fiance asked me to not be in the wedding. And for me to not be in their wedding would have just absolutely done nothing but ignite chatter in this congregation of 3,000 people for whom the grapevine moved incredibly quickly. Mm. And that was the turning point for me, because not only did it break my spirit, but it also said to me that this was an unsafe place. I didn't come out to them telling them that I was in love with him and he should be with me and not her, or that I was doing all sorts of, I was having all sorts of involvement with men. I came out in truth and with a sense of honor and reaching for their support. And to have been so dissed and dismissed in that way was traumatizing for me. But that's what it took for me to say, okay, now it's time for me to leave. And that's when I set into motion my exit path.
So after this happens to you, that's devastating. Where were you able to turn for support? Were you able to turn to your family, like you said, maybe your high school and college friends who maybe had a different attitude and were able to be more supportive of you at this time?
I was seeing a wonderful therapist. That was hugely important. I turned for support to, exactly right, my college and high school friends who had always been waiting for me to live in my own truth and therefore live a full life. And then I began to actually cultivate a group of queer gay friends, many of whom had had interactions with the church and had, to some degree, the experiences that I had. So I had these three pockets of support. And eventually I found in 1994, one of the first LGBT kind of charismatic Pentecostal Black church experiences here in New York City called Unity Fellowship of Christ Church. And knowing that they were there was transformative for me. I went once thinking, my God, I'm going to be turned into a pillar of salt. And if that doesn't happen, the roof is going to cave in, or we're all going to be caught up in flames in this building preaching gay and God is okay. And it took me 6 months to go back because I was so terrified by the first experience. But not only was I terrified, but what I didn't realize was that I was actually internally being transformed. So knowing that this new move was there, having my college friends and my high school friends, having a new group of queer, gay, Black male friends who looked like me and could identify with my experience, and having a wonderful therapist, those were the pillars that I was able to put in place that became the bridge that got me over.
Right. And as far as your faith, though, to this day, obviously you're devoutly religious. And so it sounds like maybe you're saying, was your faith shaken at all? How were you able to reconcile the kind of, whether they be doctrinal or scriptural parts of the religion that prohibit homosexuality with the fact that you knew that was your identity, and maybe you felt like you had to leave your church, but you didn't want to abandon your faith?
That is absolutely right. And it is, in fact, my faith that kept me. We call the anointing the oil of God. And we say that God places individual oil on our heads that flows down, as the kings of Israel were literally anointed with Samuel's horn of oil. The oil for David and the oil for Saul and the oil for Samson were for Solomon rather, were all different because their assignments were different. So the oil was uniquely customized to empower them and equip them with the tools that they needed to accomplish their assignment. I was always clear that fresh oil rested on my head. It didn't matter what was going on inside of me. The oil was there. The Spirit of God was there. The connection with God was there. That is the thing that kept me. Those are the jewels that I held onto. That was the anchor that held me, so that there was always a disconnect between what I'm feeling on the inside makes me worthy of death and is an abomination, but what I am also feeling on the inside is a connection to God, where I know that my anchor holds and grips, as the Pentecostals say, the solid rock. That grip of the solid rock is the thing that kept me. It was actually my faith that kept me as much as the theology terrorized me.
And to turn to just the scripture for a second, because I think maybe for people who aren't as well versed in the religion as you are, right? I think a lot of the time the stumbling block people face with reconciling religion with homosexuality, whether it be your faith or any other one really, any of the other ancient faiths, particularly the Abrahamic ones, is the kind of idea of doctrinal literalism, the idea that you have to adhere to the exact word of God as it was presented 6,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, whatever the case may be. So when you face those kinds of, and I don't know the New Testament as well as I do the Old Testament, which is, maybe I shouldn't say this, but my own faith, Judaism, the shocking revelation right there. So when you face those kind of scriptural challenges, how do you explain that to people? And how, for people, especially in your own faith, who might cite those to you and say, this is where it says that what you're doing is wrong, or this is where God said that this is wrong. How do you overcome that? Or how are you able to reinterpret it for them to show them what you're explaining?
At Vassar, I was a religion major, and of course, it's a really small school, and you can imagine that the religion department wasn't the English department or the art history department, so there were not that many of us. And we would have there was a half-unit course, 6-week course, where all of the religion majors and all of the religion faculty were in a course together, and each week the faculty would present and give an assignment from their particular expertise. There was a visiting professor, and her name was Mary Carroll Smith, and she taught primitive religions and the goddess. And her assignment was for us to do a reading on the goddess and to then write a paper about the goddess. The last paragraph of my paper was a series of questions in which I was just asking about who the goddess is. The point that I'm trying to make is I could not write an appropriate description of the goddess without first having to conjure up in my mind a notion of God, tall and a big beard with a big cane and a white robe. And then I had to impose upon this picture feminine attributes in order to get to the goddess. I'll never forget this. I love telling this story because I got a B- over a B on the paper, which I won't forget. But despite that, Mary Carroll Smith read my paper aloud in class because she said, "This is why I teach. I know that he comes from a particular background that you described, fundamentalist and with a literalist interpretation of the text. But this is why I teach, so that you learn how to ask questions." And in that moment, I realized that I had the power and the right to question assumptions that did not make sense, at least intellectually. My intellectual inquiry broke open my ability to then, from a spiritual perspective, be able to interrogate the text. That was the beginning of my journey. And now I interrogate the text and I interpret the text within an understanding of its context. I am not a literalist. I'm not a fundamentalist. I don't take the Bible literally, but I take it seriously.
I think the best response to those kinds of objections that I was leveling from an imaginary interlocutor is the idea that, given that God, at least not always, but a lot of the time, is about forgiveness and mercy, and Jesus is about forgiveness and mercy, the idea that Jesus would have turned on someone, or God would have turned on someone for their sexuality, always kind of seemed out of bounds. That always seemed kind of crazy. And yet, obviously, like you said, a lot of people think that, and a lot of people, and even you, as someone who was facing these revelations about yourself, at first felt like that. You felt like when you went to the church in the 90s that you had joined, that you were going to turn to a pillar of salt, or the roof was going to cave in.
Absolutely. Yes.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
No, please, you finish, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, and so that church in the 90s was kind of a transitional step along the way to what you eventually did, which, like you said, is start your own church.
No question about that. That experience was quite glorious for me. And although I had been in the pulpit in my first church, I remember meeting with the pastor and telling him about my life and that I was called to ministry. But I didn't want to be a minister. I just wanted to be a young, free, gay Black man in New York City who was able to discover all of who he was, realize the world beyond the church, and not have to do that while being saddled with the constrictions of the office of the clergy. And so I had a wonderful 4-year experience being kind of a front row member who was deeply invested, who was living for ministry as I was being ministered to, and who was learning and studying and doing all sorts of my own self-study and self-care. But yes, that experience was definitively transformative for me. And one of the things that was most important was that the theology was grounded in the spirit of inquisition and reasonableness, but spirit was completely familiar. The sounds, the songs that we sung, the speaking in tongues, the clapping of our hands, the lifting of our hands, the ways in which we rejoice and danced in the spirit were wonderfully familiar. And so to marry that with this open and inquisitive theology was just a wonderful time in my life.
When you eventually did start your church, and you said 2006, what was the reception to that like?
As I said, I grew up in the advertising world. And what I did was in 2005, I actually went back to the church that I described earlier, where I was, where I left because my best friend had asked me to leave, or had asked me to not be in his wedding. And I did that because I knew that I was about to launch Rehoboth. And I didn't know if I would ever be able to go back to Refuge Temple. where I had grown up. And I wanted to be home again before I now went out and publicly became like one of the first openly gay pastors in Harlem and did this work. But in order to build the ministry, at that point I was actually running a small ad agency. And so I was a part-time pastor-elect or pastor in waiting. I had a small crew of about 8 to 10 people who were following me. We were worshiping at Columbia University a bit and at the Y. And so in order to grow the congregation, I was like, well, I'll do what I know. And I took out a full-page ad in what is the Amsterdam News, which is kind of like, the New York Times for Black people in New York City. And it was an invitation. It was called Progressive Pentecostals. And it was an open letter to the African-American community about my experience, about my journey, about the church that I was starting. But it was also hard-hitting in that I lifted up. These are the reasons that I believe these are the reasons that describe the particular texture of homophobia that we experience in the Black community and in the Black church. And I am challenging these. And I invite you to the well called Rehoboth to drink from the waters of freedom. And let's have a conversation about inclusion in the Black church. And I had at least 70 people on the first Sunday because people were stunned and amazed that somebody would put out this kind of an ad in the Amsterdam News. So we built from there.
If that was what the reception was like in New York, which is obviously, sounds like it was very positive, even at the beginning, and New York obviously is a pretty progressive city and has been for a long time. Now, to switch gears just a little bit to the work that eventually led you to the Pan-Africanism that you talked about and that connection.
Yes.
What was, when you first went to Uganda in 2009, for those who don't know, what was this situation like? With the bill you were talking about in their parliament, what was it like, and how did you find it on the ground when you first went there?
The bill was introduced in 2009. It was the anti-gay bill, which was officially called the Bahati bill. MP Bahati was the legislator who was carrying the water and leading the movement. Pastor Simpa was his collaborator from a faith perspective. Uganda had been emotionally it was just amazing how the hearts and minds of the Ugandan people had been set ablaze with homophobia and with anger and with just the level of vitriol was just almost indescribable. And what I realized when I got there was that this was nothing but a distraction from a failed state, a failed government that was not able to deliver on creating an economy that lifted its people out of poverty, that was not delivering on a fair political system that was able to get rid of their dictator, and that they were essentially in bed with the religious right of our country, the white religious right, who made a deal with Uganda. We will lift up the hands of President Museveni politically if you give us unfettered access to your financial resources without having to pay market value, because we're going to distract the population and there's going to be no movement that holds the government accountable for the treacherous economic relationship between this dictator and America. And in return, what the religious right got was an international headquarters to basically plant the seeds of creating a state where the law of Christ and the law of the land were going to be one. And so Uganda was the incubator. It was the laboratory, rather, for this kind of a theological experiment. And when I realized that this was not just homophobia, but the racialization of homophobia that was steeped in a colonial adventure, albeit a modern day or post-colonial or neo-colonial adventure that was led by spirituality as the smokescreen to economic exploitation, I was just beside myself as a Black man from America that this is what white conservative Christians were doing in my motherland, in the place where I came from. Not only were they the same people that were lifting up excessive policing, not only were they lifting up what I believe were tax policies which were unfair, healthcare access which was not good for my community, and the list goes on, matters of financing education through local tax dollars, which means that if you live in a wealthy neighborhood, you get a better school. And if you live in a poor neighborhood, you don't. This was all supported by the religious right. And they were the same ones that were over in Africa that were exploiting the culture, that were exploiting the economy and the political fabric of many places in Africa for their own gain. That just infuriated me. And I think that that was much of the reason that I set out on a path to say to African Americans and Africans, we actually have so much more in common than divides us. And one of the things that we have in common is that there are evangelical conservatives who have a very particular agenda and vision for what our lives should be. And that is not for the health, life, and well-being of Black Americans or Black Africans.
Suffice to say, the situation was not good when you first went to Uganda.
Suffice it to say that the situation was really not good when I first went to Uganda. I was obviously to some degree afraid for my life, but again, the oil of God was on my head. And as much as in my human self, I was afraid for my life, when you're called to something like that, there is a certain boldness that I think Spirit places upon you that allows you to fly above your kind of human potential and actually work this work through the Spirit, which is a wonderful thing, because then you have to give Spirit credit for what only Spirit could do through you, because I had reached my own limitations as a human being, and it was the work of God through me, and I'm grateful for that. But yes, the situation there was dire. LGBTI people were being terrorized, were being threatened, were being thrown out of their homes, they were being bullied, in some cases murdered. We did experience the murder of one of our key leaders in 2011. It was a dire situation.
After this first experience, did you immediately get involved in the kind of work you do now, where you're in Africa actually almost as much, or you were before the pandemic, almost as much as you are in New York? You were between Rwanda, Kenya, Uganda, the Congo even occasionally. So when you first came back from that initial trip to Uganda, how did that eventually translate to what you do now?
Absolutely. When I came home, I realized that I had this incredible opportunity to work with Bishop Senyonjo to actually build out a faith proposition on the ground for marginalized people, LGBTI people in particular. And so I became very focused on what can I do to help them to build out a stable community of faith that also had some traction as it related to advocacy. And I invited the leader of the liberation movement, his name is Frank Mugisha, to the United States. And we organized a tour for him, because I realized that my job was both to help them have the resources that they needed for their spiritual walk, but to also be an ambassador and an advocate for them here in the halls of Congress and in other places of influence in the United States, to be able to push back against the bill. Now, I, of course, did this with many other people, from Amnesty International, American Jewish World Service, the Human Rights Campaign, the list goes on. But from a faith perspective, I was able to lift up that voice, and I was able to lift up the voice of, this is not just about helping gay people around the world. This is about helping Black gay people around the world. And therefore, I have a very particular connection to them, which positions me in this fight or struggle in a very particular way. So in time, the work morphed from Uganda, as you've spoken to other parts of East Africa, because what was beginning to happen was that the anti-gay climate was also beginning, that scent was beginning to spread across East Africa. And so there was a need to be in the other places. It was also important to be in those other places because we needed to lift up the possibility that were not as severe as Uganda, so that we could surround Uganda a bit and expose the possibilities of hope and reconciliation and opportunities for queer people to actually breathe and have a zone in which they didn't feel threatened.
And if my memory serves, there was one particular domino when a gospel musician from Africa was with you in New York that kind of finally set all of this in motion. So how did you meet him? How did that connection eventually drive you to be where you are today?
I love that you remember this story.
It's a remarkable story.
Tone was his name. He now goes by B. Slade. He was a Grammy Award winning gospel musician. And he came out on a show on BET that was a very popular kind of it was almost like, if you can imagine, kind of a Wendy Williams-ish show in the Christian zone, okay, the Lexi show. And she had Tone on, and she just kept grilling him because of the rumors that had been swirling, not just about him, but 65% of most gospel musicians, certainly male, are queer. And she pushed him, and he just kind of answered and told her the truth. He didn't expect to tell the truth. He didn't go on the show planning to tell the truth. And he left the show realizing, I think I just came out. And this was in 2009. And I reached out in the late 2009, and I reached out to him in that January of 2010 to say, how are you doing? I'm sure everybody in the world is calling you. I just wanted to reach out to say I'm pastoring this LGBTI church in New York. And by the way, it's our anniversary in May. I would love for you to come to our church. And he responded to me and said, I have gotten 2 phone calls. You are the third. So no, everybody's not calling me. Nobody's asked me to preach for them since then. And yes, I've done a little research on you and your ministry. I would love to come to New York to preach for your anniversary. Of course, my church was thrilled. The city of New York was thrilled. I had like 300 people in my church, and we averaged about 80 on a Sunday for that anniversary in May. We worshiped at 1:30. So we went to 2 churches that morning of my anniversary who worship at 10 or 11. And as we were driving back from Brooklyn to Harlem to get to my anniversary service, my 4th anniversary service, which started at 1 or 1:30, the traffic on the Brooklyn Bridge was just ridiculous. We were bumper to bumper. So I could literally, it was a parking lot, so I could turn and look at him and talk because we weren't moving. And as we were driving, we were in the spirit because we had just come from 2 worship services. So we were kind of in that mode. He just said to me, the Spirit of the Lord has spoken to me and said that you are called to Rehoboth and what you're doing, but you're also called to Africa. And you're going to get involved in this situation in Uganda. And you need to really just prepare yourself because that's what's coming. Now, I mean, I had been to Africa once the year before and to Cape Town, right? Which is not exactly, your typical spot in sub-Saharan Africa. I didn't know anybody in Uganda. I was speechless at the thought of what he was prophetically uttering because I just didn't have material to work with to say there are breadcrumbs that could lead to that direction. This truly came out of nowhere. And it was about 3 weeks later that I got a call from GLAAD, the Gay and Lesbian Anti-Defamation League, saying, we're doing a lot of media work to try to support Bishop Senyonjo because of his support for the LGBTI community in Uganda. He's coming to New York on June 20th. Would you come and meet with us? Because we would love for you to do a town hall meeting with him at your church and do like a presentation of his work and a Q&A. I think I probably didn't respond for about 10, 15 seconds when I was on the phone with Ann Craig, the director of faith engagement at GLAAD at the time. And she was kind of like, Joseph, are you there? Pastor Joseph, are you there? And I was like, yes, Ann, I'd love to do this. And I'm really grateful. I can't really explain to you why I'm kind of speechless at the moment, but I was speechless because the Lord used him to speak that into my life, and it unfolded quickly.
And ever since then, that kind of started the trajectory that you've been on, where you're back and forth every couple months.
Absolutely. The pace wasn't that quick to begin with, but over time, yes. And eventually what happened with my local church was it was clear that I needed to turn them over or to merge us or find another pastor. I needed to be mature enough, having founded and built the church with my blood, sweat, and tears and deep financial contribution, to look at my congregation and say, you deserve a shepherd, you deserve a pastor who is mentally and emotionally and not only and physically present with you. And so there was another church that was a part of my network in the Bronx. We were in Manhattan, and we got together and we merged, and that woman remained on as the pastor of the collective church. We demoted me to being an associate pastor, but then my national movement elevated me as the minister of global justice. And that really set me free to pursue this incredibly humbling work that I'm blessed to do today.
And the organization under which you do that work today is TFAM, right? The Fellowship of Affirming Ministries?
That's exactly right.
And if memory serves, you have counterparts who do kind of what you do all around the world. That includes Africa, obviously, where you spend a lot of your time. But I believe you might have told me that you have a counterpart in China, if that's correct. in people in South America, all over the world, really.
I'm so blessed. I have a wonderful counterpart, Reverend Boone in jail, who does this work in China. He is in fact Mandarin, or he is Chinese and he lives in America, but he's a professor, so he spends his summer doing this incredible work throughout China. There is a group of affirming LGBT churches throughout China that serve throughout Asia, that serve under the banner of Amplify. And they are in Taiwan and Singapore and Malaysia. There's some budding ministries in India. There's some possibilities in South Korea and in Japan. And so TFAM, the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, is in covenant relationship with Amplify. They're much younger than we are. And so it's wonderful that we have this both paternal, maternal, and sibling relationship with them. It's very exciting to see that work mature. And we are beginning to put together a similar network throughout Latin America, really anchored in Brazil and in Colombia, in part because those are big pockets where there are people of African descent. So it's amazing to watch this work grow globally.
And what has the reception been like in Asia? Is it challenging there? You know, I went to Japan last year, which I have to say is a really amazing country, and I absolutely loved it and could have spent 3, 4, 5, 6 more months there. But I was very struck by the fact that as I think many people know, it's a very kind of closed off and repressive culture. Nobody jaywalks, which as a New Yorker was appalling to me. And at a certain point, I had to stop being polite and just tolerate the dirty looks and get on with my day. But that being said, Japan is obviously famous for no one really holds hands in the street. God help anybody who kisses someone in the street, homosexual or heterosexual. So I would be really interested to hear, what is it like in China, which obviously has a very different kind of government than the United States, and throughout the rest of Asia that you've dealt with?
China has been a fascinating example because the Chinese are far more interested in what are you doing as an organized place of religion, as opposed to what are you doing with regard to lifting up the values of inclusion. And clearly, as you've addressed and aptly spoken to, many pockets of Asian culture resist homosexuality out of just the ways in which having a child as one's heir is so important. And it's really just very similar to Africa in this regard in terms of the family and procreation. There's such a premium on it. So there's cultural resistance, but I will say that you don't find the same kind of vehement and violent resistance that you find in Africa, in other places. It is much more of this is gravely out of sync with our culture. Now, there are some pockets of Islam throughout Asia where the resistance is far deeper. But again, it's much more of how do we reconcile our culture as opposed to our politics and matters of how we organize ourselves socially. It's much more of a hit on the culture. But the Chinese have been very smart and savvy. They've even talked about legalizing gay marriage themselves, mostly, I believe, because it has happened in Taiwan. I was there for Gay Pride 2 years ago, which was a demonstration with Amplify, a demonstration leading to the preachers and pastors led the Gay Pride of 2018, and that helped to tip the vote in the parliament in Taiwan for gay marriage. And I think that the Chinese government saw that and said, let's actually just begin to inch toward that ourselves, so that we don't have a social movement on our hands that somehow would even be perceived as having pushed us to do it, which I thought was very Chinese and very savvy of them. So it's interesting. It's complicated, different, but very interesting.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And that definitely accords with kind of the little that I know about Chinese government and functioning. And to turn back to just Rwanda for a second, because we haven't really talked about that much, but that's obviously a place you spend a lot of time.
Yes.
So Rwanda is obviously a fascinating country, because even among African nations that have, many of them faced civil war, internecine strife, ethnic conflicts, religious conflicts. I mean, but not to say anything of the legacy of colonialism, both economic, slavery, everything like that. Even among all of those nations that have dealt with all those horrible things, Rwanda has a particularly horrible, especially recent history with the genocide that took place not that long ago. So when you enter a place like that, where do you even start? As you came into Rwanda at a time when the country is actually pretty successful, not only in the scheme of African nations, but generally in the world. It's pretty safe, as you've told me. It's economically pretty strong, and it's overall moving in, it seems like, pretty good directions. So when you come in there, where do you start? Where does your work start when you enter a place like that?
The first thing that I do entering into any new space is to listen and to observe and to really try to absorb both the pain and the aspirations of the country. And it was very clear to me when I entered Rwanda that the Rwandese people at large were still intentionally recovering from what they had been through in the 90s, and that the scourge of the genocide still lingered as one would expect that it would have. And out of this horror, most unfortunate horror, came an opening for LGBTI people to actually live in peace, in that the idea of cloaking someone with a label because they are different or because they are of a certain way was too close to the idea of labeling someone because they were Tutsi or Hutu. And so this idea of encircling a group and targeting them, I think, sent chills down the spine of the average Rwandese person, because it ignited all of their horrific memories of how they experienced that same kind of marginalization, and obviously not just emotional, but severe physical violence and attacks. And so it is the unfortunate history of that country that has actually made it one of the safest places for queer people on the continent of Africa, because they remember and they have not forgotten. And unfortunately, out of the horrors that they've suffered, they've been able to produce something quite beautiful.
That is absolutely fascinating to say that from something so horrible that it could create those conditions that for your work would help you facilitate what you're trying to do.
That's absolutely the case.
And in Rwanda specifically, what is the situation like today for LGBTQI people? I guess I'd be curious to hear, not only right now, today, 2020 in July, but in all the years you've been there, how have you seen it evolve?
I must give credit to President Paul Kagame, who, from an American perspective, I think is a leader who has challenged America regarding the depths to which the country really operates fully democratically in terms of there being a viable second party. Let me table that for the second, because beyond that, he has been incredibly visionary. He is progressive, obviously incredibly smart, and he is an inspired and inspiring leader. And I think that it is out of his looking toward the future to ensure that he not only builds a country that's right for today, but that prospers tomorrow, that he has seen the writing on the wall globally with regard to the fact that human sexuality in its diversity is a part of the human condition. It is not an aberration, and it is not un-African. And out of his political foresight, perhaps more than his heart, which I won't judge, he has created a society that is very open to women in leadership, particularly in government, but also that is tolerant of queer people. He knows the work that we're doing. He's aware of the work that we're doing. But I think that what he has respected is that we have done the work of building up our community, but also building it in an inclusive way. Of the 4 churches that I've helped to build, I have far more straight people in our church in Rwanda than any of my other churches, which are about 85% LGBT, if not 90. In Rwanda, my church is 50% LGBT. That is a remarkable statistic in the heart of East Africa. And much of that is because of the climate that he has created, because he wants Rwanda to not only be the Singapore of Africa, but financially, but I think that from a social perspective, he wants it to be the most progressive place on the continent as well. And he did something remarkable when the HIV/AIDS conference the Pan-African HIV/AIDS conference came to Rwanda last year, the government issued a memo saying, you are going to see different looking people. They will be trans, they will be men who will be far more effeminate than you're used to seeing. And what's important is that they are here for a conference to talk about HIV and AIDS. We welcome them to Rwanda that they might engage in this incredibly important work, which will benefit the life and health and well-being of Africans. I think that that is an incredible statement.
That's really remarkable, not only for a country that has a more recent history with progressivity like this, but that's really remarkable, it sounds like, for any nation,
I think
as regards these communities.
Absolutely right. That is absolutely right. Absolutely.
It would probably be really hard to have any good data in a place where coming out and being gay, lesbian, et cetera, is largely stigmatized still. But what is your sense as to what the LGBTI populations of these countries, Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya, where you've been, do you have any sense as to how large those populations are?
It's such a good question. And the truth is that we do and we don't. Now, unfortunately, we do because of the rates of HIV and AIDS among heterosexual couples who are married, and looking at the rates of transmission. It had to come from somewhere. And so that is one measure of bisexual conduct, right, among heterosexual men, right, which speaks to numbers. But in terms of quantitatively knowing who is who, that's just not the case. We do know how large the activist community is. And so I think right now, again, the quantitative measure country to country is how large is your activist community. And then we have to kind of project and make some real kind of hypotheses and assumptions around what the real size of the broader queer community is in these different countries.
And I would imagine it's even more difficult in places like Uganda, where, as you talk about, even when you first went there, it was 2009, but I don't know that it's gotten that much better, and especially it's not in the situation Rwanda is today.
There's no question about that. It is that is absolutely the case. It is very, very, very difficult to judge in that regard. And then there are so many people who know who they are, but they're functionally bisexual, and because of their commitment to African culture and their parents, they do what they need to get along.
And to turn to the Congo for just 1 second, where I know you haven't spent quite as much time, but you do go.
Yes.
What is it like going to a nation like that, which is still in the throes of Ebola largely, or not as much as it was, but is still dealing with that and the aftermath of it, as well as a very unstable government?
That is the place where my ministry was broadened. Beyond just the LGBTI proposition, that is where the spirit of Pan-Africanism gripped my soul, and where I realized that so much of what I'm called to do is not just around, and I shouldn't say just around, but I should say is not only around, because if it were only just around, that would be glorious too, but it's not only around LGBTI dignity, it is also an opportunity for LGBTI people to lead in developing a 21st century Pan-Africanist movement. And the reason that Congo arrested me in that way is because there are $34 trillion worth of materials in the Congo. Coltan, 10% of the world's gold deposit is in the Congo. Let me say that again. 10% of the world's gold deposit is in that one country. And yet it is one of the poorest countries in Africa, and certainly one of the most violent. It is one of the most violent because many of the European countries, and to some degree Canada, and maybe even America, certainly the Chinese, are well with the fact that Africans are killing each other over small resources, because that distracts them from having a movement which pushes the government to keep out foreign governments from basically being completely extractive, robbing and stealing the minerals, paying off the government a tithing of that, and then they make a bundle because they've essentially looted the place, and the resources are not there to benefit the people or to benefit people of African descent like me, who claim our lineage from sub-Saharan Africa. It was my engagement with that understanding that really set my heart ablaze around the Pan-Africanist work that I do. So that is the place where my ministry evolved beyond just LGBTI work to really being a Pan-Africanist.
So analogously, like you said about how the genocide, obviously in a lot of horrible ways, but it ended up paving the way for Rwanda's current climate. In a sort of similar vein for you, seeing a country like the Congo that's in the kind of shape that it's in has helped you broaden your scope as well.
There's no question about that. Denis Mukwege is a doctor, a surgeon, and he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2018. And when I read about his story, where it's just a terrible and glorious thing, he repairs the torn genitalia of women who have been raped, because rape as an act of war is off the chain in Congo. And when I realized that, I thought, what an incredible opportunity there is here to actually speak to the fact that this is Congo today, but there's going to be another Congo tomorrow. And that means there's got to be a revival of Pan-Africanism where we elevate the sacredness of female identity, where we embrace the equitable existence of women as always being safe, where we teach our young boys a masculinity that is not a toxic masculinity, where we engage in collaborative and creative economics, where we connect with the rest of sub-Saharan Africa and the African diaspora to enjoy the benefits of the resources that are under the ground in Congo for the uplifting of the race. My heart was turned in Congo.
So when you start to talk about that, you're turning your eyes a little bit. So we've talked a lot about the history and your own history. You're turning your eyes a little bit to the future of not only the Congo, but that I think the description you just applied to the Congo could apply to many other nations, the ones you've worked in and others as well. So I think this is a great point for us to kind of put a bow on it and wrap it up. But I want to close with, so I recently finished this book called The Decadent Society, which for anyone who doesn't know it is by Ross Douthat, who's a columnist over the New York Times. And it was really, really incredible book. A lot of what he does is he talks about how, basically prevailing trends in the Western world. So he talks about economic stagnation in the face of what he calls boosterism, the idea that people think the economy is in a lot different shape than maybe it actually is, given many indicators. He talks about a cultural decline in the West, how movies and books tend to repeat themselves a lot, and everything's a reboot or a redo, or there's nothing original anymore. But and a very interesting one he talks about too is demographic decline. That not only Japan, famously, to go back to them, has a very rapidly aging population, but so does the United States, interestingly. And fertility rates are declining, and that's true in Europe as well. So, like I said, to wrap it up kind of nicely and to turn an eye to the future, This author talks about how Africa is one of the only places in the world that cuts against all those things. Africa has a lot of untapped economic growth. They do not have the same demographic crises. And this author, because he's a devout Christian as well, even makes reference to how the faith community in Africa, how strong it is, and how that gives them a certain kind of dynamism. So I guess as you look forward in the work you've done and the work you hope to do, what would you say are kind of the most exciting trends or the most exciting prospects in not only the countries you've worked in, but maybe it would be countries you want to move into where you haven't been yet, or even in the ones you're in now?
To your point and really well stated question, half of the population of Uganda today is under the age of 35. That is a remarkable statistic. There will be 1.2 billion people on the continent of Africa in the next 10 years. It will become a marketplace that will rival the marketplace of Asia. And it is these young people that are the hope of Africa. And that might seem a bit of an expected answer, but that is the truth. In the Congo, as an openly gay man, there are 4 Pentecostal churches that bring their young people together when I am there for youth revivals. And they're grounded in the spirit of advocacy and Pentecostal celebration. These young people do not want to be hateful. These young people do not want to be poor. These young people do not want to be technologically disconnected from the rest of the world. They want to be engaged. They want to be able to build a world in which they're able to thrive and to advance themselves to be not only citizens of Congo or Africa, but citizens of the world that stand on equal footing with their Asian American and European counterparts. My heart beats a little faster when I think about these young people. My soul is stirred by the possibility that I might, and clearly I'm, not their, I'm not their age, but to be a catalyst and an inspiration for them to reach toward the building of an economically prosperous, equitable, and socially inclusive society that is intimately and inextricably connected to the rest of Africa and the diaspora will be the work of my life. And I am incredibly blessed to do that work despite the clear challenges that are embedded in the work. But my future is to ignite their future. And I'm just thrilled that God has dropped me out of eternity into time in this very particular moment.
And on that resoundingly powerful note, let me thank you so much for doing this and say that I hope we get to do it again soon in the near future and hopefully in person the next time.
Indeed, indeed. Oh, what a joy.